The morning I found out, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just closed the laptop, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a cup of coffee like it was any other Tuesday. Because I needed them to think I didn't know. Not yet. I stood at that counter, the granite one Mike and I had picked out together at the Home Depot in Brentwood. The one I'd been so proud of. The one we'd argued about for a whole weekend because I wanted the dark gray and he wanted the white marble. And I just stared out the window at the backyard. The sprinklers were going. A robin was hopping across the grass. The whole world looked exactly the same as it did yesterday, and I could not understand how that was possible. Because everything I thought I knew about my life had just come apart in my hands like wet paper. I'd been awake since 4 a.m. Mike had been out of town. Work trip, he said, Charlotte, he said, Thursday through Sunday. And I'd woken up in the middle of the night the way you sometimes do when the house is too quiet and something in your body won't let you sleep. I went downstairs to get some water. And for some reason I can't fully explain, instead of going back to bed I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I just wanted to check something. One number. A balance. We had a joint savings account that we'd set up 3 years ago, right after our son Jalen was born. Mike called it the Future Fund. We both contributed automatically. We never talked about it much because that was the point. It was the kind of account you forget about on purpose, the one that's supposed to be there when you need it most. A college fund, a down payment on something bigger someday, an emergency cushion. I typed in the login. I waited for the page to load. And then I sat very, very still. $63,000. That's what should have been in that account. Mike had shown me the balance himself just 4 months ago, sitting at this same table, proud as anything. 63,000. We were on track. The balance I was looking at was $11,240. Over $50,000 was gone. And none of it had been us. I scrolled through the transaction history. My hands weren't shaking yet, that came later. Right then I was just reading. Just processing. Transfers, one after another, going back 22 months. Small ones at first. 400 here. 800 there. Then bigger. 1,200. 2,000. 3,000 in one transaction in November. Always to the same external account. An account I didn't recognize. An account I had never seen before in my life. I cross-referenced the authorized users on the account. My name. Mike's name. And one other name, added 14 months ago with transfer privileges. Linda Hargrove. My mother-in-law. I closed the laptop. I walked to the kitchen. I poured the coffee. Because the one thing I knew, even in that moment, even with the floor falling out from under me, was this. If they didn't know I knew, I had the advantage. And I was not going to waste it. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something real quick. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or your country in the comments right now. I love seeing where y'all are tuning in from. We've got people listening from all over, and every single one of you showing up here means the world to me. This channel exists because of you. Genuinely. So if this story is already hitting different, hit that subscribe button, not because some algorithm told you to, but because these are real stories, real emotions, and I show up here for you every single week. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Now listen. I've barely scratched the surface of what happened that morning. Because what I found in those bank records, that was just the beginning. None of us, not me, not anyone who knew this family, saw what was coming next. My name is Nicole. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've been living what most people, looking from the outside, would call a pretty good life. We have a 4-bedroom house in a nice subdivision just outside Nashville. Good schools, HOA meetings on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. The kind of neighborhood where people put Christmas lights up the week after Thanksgiving and wave at you from their driveways. Mike is in commercial real estate. He travels a fair amount, drives a nice truck, coaches Jalen's T-ball team in the spring. We're that family. The one you see at the 4th of July cookout and think, yes, they've got it together. I grew up in Atlanta. Moved to Nashville when I was 26 for a marketing job that I loved. Met Mike 8 months later at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. And honestly, I didn't think he was that special at first. He was charming in a rehearsed kind of way, like he'd spent time in front of a mirror practicing it. But he was kind. He was patient. He remembered things. The second time we went out, he brought me a specific flavor of macarons from a French bakery, because I'd mentioned, one single time, that I'd had them in Paris during a college trip and thought about them sometimes. That kind of detail. That's what got me. We got married 3 years after we met. I quit my job when Jalen came because the math didn't make sense. Daycare was almost as much as my salary, and honestly, I wanted to be home with him. Mike made enough. We were fine. More than fine, really. I threw myself into motherhood, into this house, into building something stable and warm and real. I planted a garden in the backyard. I learned how to bake sourdough. I volunteered at Jalen's preschool twice a week. I was present. I was all in. I believed completely in the life we were building. Mike's mother Linda came into the picture slowly. She lived about 40 minutes away in a condo in Franklin, and she'd been divorced from Mike's dad, Derek, for years. She was in her late 50s, always put together, always smelling like expensive perfume, always bringing over casseroles and calling Jalen my baby. I liked her genuinely. She had this way of making you feel like she was rooting for you, like she saw something special in you that other people might miss. When I was pregnant and exhausted, she'd come over and just take over, laundry, dishes, dinner, without being asked. I thought she was a blessing. I thought she was family. She babysat Jalen every other Thursday so I could have a day to myself. Grocery run, lunch quiet. It felt like a gift. It felt like love. I want you to hold on to that image of her. Because I'm going to need you to understand exactly who I thought Linda was, so you understand exactly how sick the truth made me feel. There were things I noticed, in those early years, that I filed away without examining. Small things. Linda always seemed to know about money stuff before I told her, like she'd ask how the savings were going before I'd mentioned it. Once, she made a comment about our future fund account, called it by that name, which was just a Mike and Nicole thing, not something we'd said around other people. I remember thinking, did Mike mention that? And then I moved on, because there was a toddler on the floor pulling books off the shelf, and I had bigger things to focus on. Mike, for his part, was a good husband in the visible ways. He was home for dinner most nights when he wasn't traveling. He was affectionate in public, the kind of man who puts his hand on your lower back when you walk into a room together. He remembered our anniversary. He told me I was beautiful. He made me feel, consistently, like I was the center of his world. The things I noticed that were slightly off, I explained them away every single time. Because when you love someone, you do that. When you trust someone, you do that. You take the thing that doesn't quite fit, and you sand down the edges until it does. You don't even realize you're doing it. You think you're being generous, being understanding, being the mature one. You don't realize that what you're actually doing is handing them the knife and asking them to be gentle. That was my life. Warm mornings, coffee in my garden, Jalen's laughter bouncing off the kitchen tile, Mike's truck in the driveway. Safe. Whole. Mine. Or so I thought. It started the way these things always start, with something small enough to dismiss. 14 months before that early morning with the laptop, so about 2 years into the theft, though I didn't know that yet, I was doing laundry. It was a Saturday. Mike was home, watching college football in the living room, and Jalen was down for a nap. I was pulling things out of Mike's jacket pockets the way you do before you throw it in the wash, and I found a receipt. A restaurant receipt. Viceroy Steakhouse, downtown Nashville. Dinner for 2. A bottle of wine I recognized as not cheap. A Saturday night 3 weeks prior. I stood there in the laundry room for a moment. Mike had been out that Saturday. He told me he was going to watch the game at his buddy Brandon's. Brandon, who he'd known since college. That wasn't unusual. But dinner for 2 at a nice steakhouse wasn't watching the game at Brandon's. It just wasn't. I put the receipt in my pocket. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Work dinner he forgot to mention. A client. Something he'd handled through the office account but paid personally and needed to be reimbursed. Real estate guys do those kinds of dinners all the time. I knew that. That night after Jalen was in bed, I was casual about it. I said, "Hey, you never mentioned a work dinner a few weeks back, a Saturday. I found a receipt in your jacket." And Mike looked at me, didn't miss a beat, and said, "Oh yeah, that client, the one from Charlotte I've been trying to close. He was in town, his wife too, we took them out. It was a whole thing. Sorry, I should have mentioned it." He said it easily, lightly, like it wasn't a thing at all. And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He'd never given me a reason not to. But something in me saved that moment. Not consciously, I wasn't cataloging evidence, I wasn't suspicious in any organized way. It was more like my nervous system stored it, without asking my brain's permission. Filed under, explain later. A couple months after that, I was picking Jalen up from Linda's on a Thursday, and she said something that stuck with me. Jalen was putting his shoes on by the door, and Linda was straightening up, and she said offhandedly, "You know, Nicole, you're good to let Mike keep such a tight hold on the finances. A lot of women want to be in the middle of everything, and it just causes friction." I laughed a little confused and said something like, "Oh, we both keep track." And she smiled and said, of course. But the way she said it, the way she turned away right after, it didn't sit right. Because Mike and I had always managed money together. That had always been our thing. Why would she characterize it as Mike keeping a tight hold? I filed that away too. There was one more thing, about 6 months before I found the bank statement. We were at Thanksgiving dinner at Linda's. The whole family was there, Mike's cousin Ryan, his wife Megan, their kids. It was loud and warm, and Linda had cooked everything from scratch, which she loved to do. At some point, someone made a toast and mentioned Linda's new chapter, and everyone raised their glasses, and I looked at Mike and mouthed, "What new chapter?" And he shrugged and said, "She's just been doing some investing, nothing big." And I thought, oh, okay. People invest. Good for her. I lifted my glass and smiled. But I thought about it later, that night, lying next to Mike in bed while he slept. Where had Linda gotten money to invest? She was on a fixed income from a part-time bookkeeping job and whatever divorce settlement she'd gotten from Derek years ago. She wasn't wealthy. She'd mentioned money being tight more than once over the years. So where was this new chapter coming from? I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself that people come into money in all kinds of ways. Maybe Derek had finally paid off a debt. Maybe she'd gotten an inheritance of her own. I told myself that it was none of my business, that it was rude to pry into a woman's finances, that I was being suspicious of someone who had done nothing but love my family. I told myself everything was fine. And I got up the next morning and made breakfast and watched Jalen run across the backyard in his pajamas, and I thought, I have a good life. I am a lucky woman. Stop looking for problems that aren't there. That was the last time I told myself that. Because 12 weeks later was the early morning with the laptop, and after that, there was no telling myself anything anymore. There was only the truth and what I was going to do with it. I spent 3 days after finding that bank statement acting completely normal. I want you to understand how hard that was. I smiled at breakfast. I drove Jalen to preschool and chatted with the other moms in the parking lot. I texted Mike pictures of the garden and said, "Miss you," and he texted back a heart. I called Linda on Thursday to confirm Jalen's drop-off, and she said, "Of course, baby, I'll have his snacks ready." And I said, "You're the best, Linda," and she laughed and said, "I know." And I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and breathed through my nose for about 2 full minutes without moving. The first thing I did, and I mean the very first deliberate thing after I'd had time to think, was call my cousin Ashley in Atlanta. Ashley's a paralegal. She's also the most no-nonsense person I've ever met in my life, which is exactly what I needed. I drove to the Target on Charlotte Pike, sat in the parking lot, and called her from my cell. I talked for 20 minutes straight. She listened without interrupting, which is how I knew she understood the gravity of what I was saying. When I finished, she said, "Don't move, don't touch a single dollar. Don't give them any reason to think you know, and get yourself a lawyer, not a couples counselor, a lawyer, before you do anything else." Then she said, "Nicole, you did not imagine this. Those transactions are real. You need to treat this like a crime because it is one." That word, crime, cracked something open in me. Because up until that point, part of my brain had still been trying to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe Mike had authorized the transfers without thinking to tell me. Maybe there was a family emergency with Linda that he'd handled and forgotten to mention. Maybe I was missing context. Ashley's word cut through all of that. This wasn't a miscommunication. Someone had stolen from me. I started documenting. Quietly, carefully, the way you learn to move when you know you're being watched, and you can't let the watcher know you've noticed. I printed the transaction history from the library on 8th Avenue, not from our home printer, not from my laptop, and I tucked it inside a copy of a novel in my nightstand. I started keeping a notes document on my phone, locked with a passcode Mike didn't know, where I logged every conversation that felt relevant, every date, every detail. Then I started looking at Linda differently. I pulled up her Facebook, which she updated sporadically, and started scrolling back through the past 2 years. 6 months ago, she'd posted a photo from a restaurant in Midtown, one of those rooftop places that runs $100 a head easy. 8 months ago, she'd posted a photo from what looked like a weekend trip to Savannah. 12 months ago, a new car in her driveway. She'd captioned it, "Treating myself, life is short, why all?" A white Mercedes C-Class. Her old car had been a 2015 Kia. I did the math. The transfers from our account corresponded almost exactly to Linda's new financial lifestyle. The timeline matched up almost dollar for dollar. Then I found the LLC. Ashley had told me to do a basic public records search. Tennessee has a business registry online, and LLCs are public filings. I searched Linda Hargrove. I found a company called Harglow Properties LLC, registered 14 months ago. The same month her name had been added to our joint account. The registered address was a condo unit in a building in East Nashville. A nice building. I looked it up. 2-bedroom units in that building were listed at around $285,000. I found the property records. Harglow Properties LLC had purchased Unit 4B for $274,000. Cash, 14 months ago. $274,000. Cash. I sat with that number for a long time. I want to be honest with you. The transfers from our account alone didn't add up to $274,000. They added up to about $52,000, which meant Linda had other money coming from somewhere else, which meant either she had resources I didn't know about, or there were other accounts I hadn't found yet, or, and this is the one that made me feel genuinely sick, Mike had been contributing in ways that didn't show up in the transactions I was looking at. I started paying closer attention to Mike's patterns when he was home. Not obvious, not anything he could read as suspicious, just paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. And I noticed that when his personal cell phone buzzed with certain texts, he'd take the phone off the table and turn the screen down before responding. I noticed that when he got off work calls, he'd sometimes stay in his truck in the driveway for 15 or 20 minutes before coming inside. I noticed that once, when I came into the living room unexpectedly, he closed a laptop tab fast and looked up at me with just a half second of something. Not guilt exactly, more like recalibration. Like someone who's used to managing what you see. A week into my quiet investigation, my friend Lauren, she and I go way back. We met at a church we both used to attend in East Nashville, texted me out of nowhere and said, "Hey, random question, did you and Mike end up buying a rental property?" I saw Mike at a coffee shop with some woman, and she had all these folders and it looked like a closing. I stared at that text for a long time. I wrote back, no, must be a client." She sent back a thumbs up and that was that. But I saved the text. And I asked Lauren, casually, over lunch that week, if she remembered what the woman looked like. She described her. Late 50s, well-dressed silver bob. Linda. Mike had been meeting with Linda. At a coffee shop. With folders. While he was supposed to be in Charlotte. I did not let Lauren see my face change. I finished my salad. I talked about her daughter's soccer tournament. I drove home. And when I got home, I called the lawyer Ashley had recommended, a woman named Patricia who specialized in divorce and financial fraud. I said, "I think I need your help." She said, "Tell me everything." And I did. Patricia moved fast once I had her on the case. She had a financial forensics contact who could do a deep review of account activity, and she also flagged something I hadn't thought of. If Mike had co-authorized Linda's access to their account, that was one thing legally, messy, but arguably a family financial matter. But if Mike had misrepresented those transfers to me, if he had actively concealed the activity while knowing I believed the money was still there, that was marital fraud. That changed the picture significantly. She advised me, very gently but very firmly, to do one thing before anything else. Check whether my inheritance money was still accounted for. When my grandmother passed away 3 years ago, I'd inherited $40,000. It had come to me in a check made out to me personally. And in a moment that I now look back on and want to shake myself for, I'd endorsed it over to our joint account. I'd made a whole thing of it at the time, sat Mike down at the kitchen table, slid the check across to him and said, "I want this to be ours, for our future." He'd teared up. He'd held my face in his hands and said I was the most generous person he'd ever known. That $40,000 was in the $52,000 that was gone. When Patricia confirmed that, when she walked me through the paper trail, and I saw it clearly, $40,000 of my grandmother's money transferred in chunks to Linda's account over 18 months, something broke in me. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet way. Like a door in my chest just closed. That money was my grandmother's whole life. She'd scrimped and saved for decades. She'd lived modestly so her grandchildren might have something. And it was sitting in a condo in East Nashville that Linda and God knows who else were living in, while I was home planting tomatoes and baking sourdough bread and thinking I had a good life. But the real discovery, the one that shattered every last piece of the version of my marriage I'd been living in, came on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after that early morning with the laptop. Mike was home. We'd had dinner together, normal as anything. Jalen had gone to bed. Mike was watching TV, and I said I had a headache and was going to lie down. I went upstairs. And I did something that Patricia had advised me I had the right to do as a co-owner of the household. I accessed the shared home computer, the one we both used for household stuff, and I went into the browser history on the account Mike used. He'd cleared the recent history. But he'd missed something. About 6 months back, there was a cached login to a secondary email account I didn't know he had. And through a password reset, don't ask me how I figured this out, Ashley's boyfriend works in IT and made a very educational phone call that evening. I got into that account. I want to say this part slowly so it lands the way it landed for me. There were emails between Mike and Linda going back 2.5 years. In those emails, they discussed the transfers explicitly. Linda would write things like, "Move the 800 same account, let me know if you see an issue." And Mike would write back, "Looks good, she never checks." Once, after a larger transfer, Linda wrote, "Michael, are you sure this is sustainable? She's going to notice eventually."